The desert made no sound, only the heartbeat beneath the armor and the hiss of sand against steel. The Egyptian army moved south like a silver serpent, dragging the banner of the Ottoman Empire behind it. To them, Sudan was a wilderness, a land of dust and silence. But to the men born of its soil, it was the grave of their fathers, and the wind that rose before them was heavy with the breath of ghosts. Makur walked last in the column. To him, every grain of sand shimmered like an eye. He didn't raise his head, only gripped his spear tighter. The officer's command was swallowed by the storm. Then, far ahead, something black jutted from the dunes, a block of stone, dark as coal, glinting under the merciless sun. Night fell without warning. The heat broke into wind, and the wind carried whispers. Under the moon, Makur saw the carving upon the stone, a pharaoh's face, dark-skinned, smiling with his eyes closed. No one else seemed to notice. The sand gathered at his feet, tugging downward as though alive. He heard his name spoken softly in a language he did not know, yet somehow remembered. At dawn, 20 soldiers were gone, buried or vanished. Makur awoke half buried in sand, the air around him cold as metal. Before him lay the entrance of a buried temple, and from within came a faint blue light. He descended the stairs, each step echoing like thunder in his chest. On the walls, thousands of figures knelt before a king of ash and sun. At the center sat a mummy blackened by fire, still clutching a scepter. His torch flared, suddenly blue. The chamber shuddered as dust fell like snow. Then the mummy's eyes opened, not bright, but infinite. A wave of cold rippled through the air. No voice was heard, yet a whisper filled Makur's mind. The Nile remembers its kings. He knelt without thought. When he rose, the throne was empty, and his hands were stained with soot that would not wash away. When he stumbled back into the daylight, the soldiers recoiled. His eyes had changed, golden, faintly glowing, reflecting the horizon. He spoke little, only murmured, "The sun will rise from the south again." The officers dismissed him as fevered, but the men began to watch him differently, as one might watch a storm forming at the edge of the world. They called him the Dark General. At night he stood alone on the dunes, facing north, where the empire lived in marble and arrogance. The wind bent around him, and the stars seemed to wait. Beneath his cloak, something old pulsed like a second heart. In the barracks, the soldiers began to share the same dream. They saw a king of ash walking through a river of blood, his crown burning black. When they woke, they found soot on their palms. One dared to ask Makur who he was. His answer was quiet, heavy. "I am the one the Nile remembers." That night, the desert trembled. The sand shifted as though breathing. From somewhere deep below came the faint beat of drums. The officers said it was thunder. The men who had dreamed knew better. The gods had turned in their sleep, and one of them had opened his eyes. The nights grew longer after that. The desert no longer cooled. It waited. Makur spoke little, but the men followed him with the quiet faith of those who had already died once and remembered it. In his presence, fires burned lower, and the sand around him seemed darker than anywhere else. Even the camels refused to meet his gaze. One night, when the moon hung red as a wound, he walked away from camp. The wind rose, and the dunes moved like waves. He returned at dawn with black dust smeared across his chest, eyes unfocused, whispering that the gods beneath the river had accepted his offering. When asked what he meant, he simply smiled and said, "The Nile runs deeper than water." In the following days, strange things began to happen. Wells turned dark, as if ink had seeped from the depths. Statues in nearby ruins were found turned toward the south, their stone faces cracked open as if by laughter. Men swore they saw figures walking in the night, shadows shaped like kings, tall and crowned with fire. The officers forbade talk of ghosts, but orders meant little when the air itself hummed with memory. Makur's hair began to turn the color of coal. His skin gleamed in the sun like polished obsidian, and his voice carried the weight of drums. He no longer saluted. He spoke to the wind, to the sand, to the unseen, and sometimes the wind answered. His tent became a place of pilgrimage. Soldiers came not to report, but to kneel. He told them the pharaohs had not died. They had been buried alive beneath the arrogance of foreign gods. "They built their thrones on our bones," he said. "Now the bones remember." His words spread like fire through dry reeds. Men painted their faces with soot, carved suns into their chests, and called themselves the children of the South Sun. When the officers tried to arrest him, their weapons turned to rust by morning. The horses refused to move. One officer, bold or mad, struck him with a whip, and when he raised his hand again, it was already blistered with burns. Makur did not look angry. He only said, "The old fire forgives no arrogance." At the next sunset, he gathered his followers outside the ruins of an ancient temple half swallowed by sand. He ordered silence. As the wind died, he drew a circle in the ground with his spear and bled into it. The blood hissed, and from the sand rose the shape of a throne made of ash. Around them, the air grew dense, heavy with centuries of sleep awakening. He lifted both hands to the sky, and the sun dimmed, not by cloud or storm, but as though something immense had passed before it. "The world has forgotten its color," he said. "We will paint it again." The crowd knelt as one, faces pressed into the earth. They said the ground itself trembled in answer, as if recognizing its master. That night, a strange light rippled along the Nile. Fishermen swore the water glowed from beneath, and that for a moment they could see faces drifting just below the surface, not dead, not alive, but watching. When they told the tale, their voices shook, not from fear, but from awe. Makur began to speak of a kingdom yet unseen, a place where no man bowed and no skin ruled another. He said it would rise from the desert like dawn. But in his eyes, the light of prophecy had turned to something harder, something that did not forgive. His followers called him the Black Pharaoh. The officers called him a heretic. The empire called him impossible. In Cairo, reports reached the palace, a general in the south claiming divine blood, turning soldiers into zealots, commanding the desert itself. The advisors laughed until the first caravan failed to return. Then another. Letters came written in charcoal, unsigned, reading only, "The sun rises from the south." By the time the governor sent troops, they found only bones and banners half buried in sand. On the dunes, a figure watched them from afar, cloak rippling like smoke. When the wind shifted, he was gone, leaving behind only the faint outline of a throne burned into the ground. And somewhere deep in the desert, beneath a sky the color of blood, the old gods whispered to each other in forgotten tongues. "The Nile remembers," they said, "and so will the world." The empire called him myth, but myths travel faster than truth. By the time Cairo sent scouts, half the southern garrisons had vanished into sand. Their flags were found days later, torn and blackened, fluttering from stakes arranged in a circle, a crown of ruin. In the center of that crown was a single word burned into the ground: return. Makur no longer hid in shadows. He walked openly at the head of his followers, bare-chested beneath the sun, the cross of ashes on his chest glimmering like metal. His army had no drums, no banners, only rhythm, the sound of feet in the sand, a heartbeat older than language. The desert swallowed their footprints as quickly as they made them, as though it conspired to hide their path. Villages joined him willingly. The poor called him king. The enslaved called him deliverance. He accepted neither title. When asked who he was, he said, "I am the echo of those you buried." And when his followers shouted Pharaoh, he did not correct them. Some said he smiled. Others said he looked sad, as if the word itself was a chain he could not break. He forbade gold, silk, or wine in his camp. He wore only black linen and carried a staff carved from the wood of a drowned tree. Every night he spoke to the river, not the Nile itself, but to a trickle of its spirit running through the sands. "You carried kings and slaves alike," he whispered. "Tell me who was free." One night he gathered his people around the ruins of an ancient pyramid, its tip broken, its shadow stretching far across the plain. He ordered them to dig, and for hours they worked in silence. When they unearthed a slab covered in hieroglyphs, he placed his hand upon it and said, "The gods wrote in fire before men learned to write in ink." The slab cracked open, and light spilled out, blue and cold. The soldiers who watched said that the light bent around him, wrapping him in a veil of shifting flame. His shadow stretched impossibly long, merging with those of his followers. When it was over, the sand was glass, and his voice had changed, deeper, older, filled with the weight of centuries. "The old empire is awake," he said. "It remembers the names we forgot." Rumors spread that he could walk across dunes without leaving prints. that his reflection refused to appear in water, that his horse's hooves never touched the ground. The empire dismissed it as madness, but madness has a way of inspiring obedience. His followers began to tattoo suns on their palms, black in perfect circles. "So that the light cannot forget us," they said. As his power grew, so did the fear. In Cairo, merchants prayed at noon with trembling hands. Officials whispered that he had found the tomb of Ra himself. The viceroy ordered every message from the south sealed before reading. But paper cannot contain prophecy. Every night, new letters appeared in the city. Ash-gray parchment, unsigned, marked with the same phrase, "The sun rises from the south." Makur's army, or his congregation, reached the Nile. There he performed the first ritual of return. He waded into the water up to his knees, raised his staff and cut his palm. His blood spread across the current like a red veil. Then he whispered, "Let the river remember." The water turned black for 3 days. Fish floated to the surface, eyes gleaming gold in the moonlight. On the 4th day, the current cleared and the air grew still. The people swore they saw shapes rising beneath the surface, men in armor of bronze, carrying torches that burned without smoke. They followed the current north, toward the empire. The villagers fell to their knees. Makur only turned away and said, "The dead are faithful soldiers." When he spoke, his words echoed as if through stone halls. He began to call his movement the kingdom of sand and ash. To his followers, it was not rebellion, it was resurrection. He said their ancestors had built the world once and would build it again, but this time without chains. At dusk, he sat upon a throne made of bone and driftwood, facing the horizon where the sun bled into the dunes. The sky turned red, then purple, then black, and his eyes reflected each color in turn. He whispered, "Every empire forgets who dug its foundations. We are the reminder." By now, even the desert seemed to obey him. Storms came when he wished for silence. The wind carved faces into the cliffs, faces that looked suspiciously like his own. At night, lightning struck without thunder, burning hieroglyphs into the sand. The priests said it was heresy. The scholars called it coincidence. The soldiers called it doom. When he marched again, the earth seemed to tremble. The air shimmered with heat that wasn't from the sun, and above him, where the light should have been golden, it had turned the color of coal. Somewhere between heaven and sand, a new empire was being born, one that would not beg to exist. The first war cry was not shouted, but sung. It rose from 1,000 throats as the dawn turned gray, the sound low and slow, like the river remembering how to breathe. Makur stood at the center of the dunes, his body painted in ash and blood, his staff planted deep in the sand. The air shimmered around him, heavy with heat that was not of the sun. When he raised his hand, the wind stopped, and for a heartbeat, the desert held its breath. He began the ritual of return. The followers formed a circle around him, silent, waiting. Makur drew symbols in the sand with the tip of his staff, spirals, suns, and the open eye of Ra, each line glowing faintly blue. He whispered words older than Arabic, older than conquest. "The sun rises not by grace," he said, "but by memory." The ground pulsed once as if answering. Then he cut his palm again and lifted the blood to the sky. The wind screamed. Lightning arced across the dunes, not white, but red. When it struck, the sand melted into glass, forming a ring that shimmered underfoot. "The gods of the north took light from us," he said. "Tonight, we take it back." That night, the stars vanished. A curtain of shadow spread across the heavens, and the moon burned black. From Cairo to Khartoum, the people saw it and trembled. The scholars called it an eclipse, but none could explain why the Nile glowed faintly crimson beneath the darkness. In the south, the followers of Makur fell to their knees and cried out, "Ra has risen in the south!" When the light returned, the desert was gone. In its place stood an army, barefoot, cloaked in smoke, their eyes gleaming like coals. They carried no flags, only torches that burned blue. Makur mounted a horse black as obsidian, its mane woven with strands of gold thread. "We do not march," he said. "We return." They swept across the plains in silence. Fortresses that had stood for decades fell without battle. The wind carried whispers into every garrison. The Black Pharaoh walks. In villages, people dropped their tools and joined the march, drawn not by loyalty but by something deeper, the sense that time itself was bending toward them. Cairo panicked. The viceroy ordered the scholars to pray, the generals to prepare, and the priests to bless the cannons. But prayers cannot stop memory, and bullets cannot wound the past. Reports came of soldiers refusing to fight, claiming they saw their ancestors walking beside Makur's army. One captain wrote, "We fire, and the smoke takes their shape." As Makur's forces approached the Nile, thunder rolled from a clear sky. He raised his hand, and the river seemed to hesitate, its flow slowing, thickening, as though listening. Then, from the depths, something vast stirred. The water rose and took shape, a figure of liquid shadow, crowned with the sun's dying light. The people watching fell flat to the ground. Makur bowed his head. "The god returns when the slave remembers," he said. The flood came that night. Villages vanished beneath water that smelled of iron and salt. Those who survived said the current whispered names, not of the living, but of those lost to chains. In Cairo, temples cracked and mirrors shattered. The priests said it was the wrath of heaven. The peasants said it was justice long delayed. Makur stood upon a cliff overlooking the drowned valley. Behind him, his army waited for command. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun fought to rise but could not pierce the clouds. "Light is mercy," he said softly, "but mercy has forgotten us, so we will learn to live in shadow." When he turned, his face was painted black from chin to brow, his eyes the color of molten gold. The soldiers knelt, calling him Pharaoh. He said nothing, but his silence felt like decree. Above them, lightning split the sky in two, and the storm began to circle, slow, deliberate, obedient. For 3 days, the empire lost contact with the south. The sand swallowed its roads, the wind devoured its maps. When communication returned, the messengers carried only fragments. Villages turned to glass, statues sweating blood, the river running backward. The viceroy refused to believe any of it. "Men do not command storms," he said. But when he looked out his window that night, the stars were gone again. By the 4th day, the storm reached the Nile Delta. Rain fell black as ink. In Cairo's streets, children pointed upward, saying the sun had eyes. The old women crossed themselves, whispering that the gods were counting. And far to the south, beneath that blackened sky, Makur raised his staff one final time and shouted, "Let the empire drown!" The storm obeyed. The storm devoured the horizon. Sand and rain moved as one, a wall of darkness marching northward. The empire's drums were drowned beneath it, its banners shredded into nothing. Makur's horse climbed the dunes as if walking on air, his cloak snapping like a flag of shadow. Behind him, the army of the black sun moved without sound, torches flickering blue in the wind. Every step they took erased the one before, as though the desert itself wanted their memory to stay untouchable. By the second night, the Nile was unrecognizable. Its waters glowed red and thick, carrying the wreckage of cities, doors, altars, bodies. In Cairo, the priests burned incense until the smoke filled the palace, begging heaven to look down again. But heaven had turned away. Only thunder answered, echoing the rhythm of war drums from the south. Makur rode at the front, face streaked with ash and blood. He no longer blinked. His eyes reflected the lightning, golden and unyielding. To his followers, he looked not like a man, but like the statue of a god returning to life. When he spoke, his voice carried farther than sound should travel. "Every chain melted once in the sun," he said. "We are the sun's return." When they reached the old fortress of Dongola, the empire's army awaited. Thousands of soldiers with rifles, cannons, banners, prayers. Makur dismounted, pressed his hand to the earth, and whispered something. The ground shuddered, and the cannons sank as if swallowed. The soldiers froze, their gunpowder damp, their faith colder than the rain. He lifted his staff, and lightning struck the flagpole, splitting it clean in half. The empire's emblem fell burning into the mud. The battle that followed was not a battle. It was a drowning. Men disappeared into dust and water. Horses screamed without sound. When dawn came, the battlefield was gone, only ripples of heat where life had been. The survivors said they saw a throne rise from the storm, built of bone and sand, and upon it sat Makur, unmoving, his face calm as eternity. He ruled no city. He wrote no laws. His empire was silence. The faithful came from far away, walking through storms to kneel at his feet. They brought offerings of salt, gold, even the weapons of their enemies, but he touched none of it. He only said, "You cannot build freedom with the tools of your masters." In the following months, the empire fractured. Provinces rebelled, governors fled, and the North Star vanished behind ash. The scholars tried to rewrite the story, calling it a local uprising, a delusion of a single madman. But the merchants refused to sail the southern Nile. They said the current sang hymns. One evening, Makur climbed the highest dune and sat beneath the red sun. Around him, his soldiers built a circle of torches. He closed his eyes. The flames bent toward him as though bowing. "Every god becomes what he hates," he murmured. "Let me end before that." The wind carried his words, scattering them like seeds. The next morning, he was gone. In his place was a throne of blackened sand, still warm to the touch. His followers waited for days, then weeks. When they left, the throne turned to dust behind them. But wherever they went, strange signs followed. Rivers running backward for an hour, statues weeping soot, birds flying in perfect circles until they fell from the sky. Years passed. The empire returned, pale and trembling. New rulers built monuments over the places Makur had walked, carving his name out of every stone. But erasure has its own shadow. When the wind blew at night, people swore they could hear footsteps in the sand and a voice whispering, "The Nile remembers." In Cairo, an officer who had once fought him woke screaming every night, dreaming of a sun that would not set. He hanged himself from his window with his military sash. On the wall behind him, the dust had settled into the shape of a black crown. Somewhere far in the desert, a shepherd boy found a single golden eye buried in the sand. It was not glass or metal. It pulsed faintly, as if still alive. When he tried to pick it up, the sand beneath him began to move, forming the faint outline of a face. He ran, never speaking of it again. Scholars today claim the Black Pharaoh never existed. They say there were no storms, no drowned cities, no miracles. But when the wind howls over the dunes of Sudan, it carries a low hum, the rhythm of drums, the march of barefoot soldiers, the sigh of water remembering its kings. And on nights when the moon burns darker than it should, the fishermen on the Nile swear they see him, a rider made of ash and gold, standing upon the water, eyes closed, waiting for the next empire to forget. The years after the storm felt hollow, as if the world had been emptied and filled again with silence. The empire reclaimed its cities, rebuilt its temples, renamed its rivers, but something in the air had changed. The sound of order no longer convinced even those who spoke it. The soldiers marched again, but their footsteps echoed as if through a tomb. The sun rose, yes, but it rose red, heavy, ashamed. Cairo sent priests to the south to purify the land. They found only ruins, glass, and wind. No bones, no bodies, as though the earth itself had swallowed its witnesses. One priest returned pale as wax and refused to speak again. He spent the rest of his life drawing circles in the dirt, muttering, "It still breathes." Years passed into decades. Children were told that the Black Pharaoh was a curse invented by rebels, a shadow cast by ignorance. Schools taught that the Nile had never run red, that the sky had never gone dark. But sometimes, at night, the river would glow faintly, and no one dared go near. Fishermen said it was the light of the dead looking for their reflections. In the villages of Sudan, old women told stories in whispers. They said Makur had not died. He had returned to the sand, sleeping beneath it like a seed, waiting for the empire to grow arrogant again. When the sun turned black once more, they said, he would rise and the river would remember its shape. The men laughed at such tales, but they too lowered their eyes when the wind blew from the south. The empire continued its wars against hunger, against memory, against itself. Each victory felt smaller. Its cities grew taller, its walls thicker, but every time it looked southward, it saw a shimmer on the horizon, as if something immense and patient was breathing just beyond sight. In one forgotten year, a drought struck. The Nile shrank until its bed cracked. Farmers digging for water unearthed strange relics, fragments of glass shaped like bones, bits of stone carved with suns. A scholar in Cairo declared them meaningless, but when he brought them home, his house filled with the scent of burning. Generations passed. The legend dulled, turned to folklore, then to nothing. The people spoke new tongues, worshipped new gods, wore the empire's colors with practiced obedience. And yet, every century, when the Nile flooded higher than it should, the old songs returned, wordless, rhythmic, older than language. The flood of 1902 washed away 3 villages. Survivors claimed the water spoke, a single phrase repeated in the roar, "The South remembers." Officials blamed superstition. The government built a dam to tame the river, a wall of stone and iron to command what had once been divine. For a time, it worked. But walls cannot contain memory. One night, when the dam's workers rested, the river rose without rain. It touched the wall, hesitated, then receded. In the morning, the foreman found a handprint burned into the cement, 5 fingers made of soot, too large to be human. Later that year, a British archaeologist uncovered a tomb sealed in black glass. Inside was nothing, only a single throne of fused sand and an inscription scorched into the wall. "He who forgets the slave will kneel before the dust." The archaeologist took a photograph, but when he developed the film, the image showed a figure seated on the throne, smiling. The photograph was locked away. It surfaced once, decades later, in a museum exhibit titled "Superstitions of the Desert." 2 days after the opening, the curator disappeared. The glass around the photograph had cracked from the inside. By the 21st century, the empire had long since changed its name. New flags, new rulers, the same old silence. Yet satellites photographing the Sudanese desert captured a strange pattern. A perfect circle 2 miles wide, blacker than the sand around it. Scientists called it a meteor impact. But when the image was enhanced, faint lines radiated outward, hieroglyphs spelling a single word: return. At night, travelers still hear the drums, low, steady, carried by the wind from the dunes. Some say it's the shifting of sand. Others swear it's the heartbeat of a god who once tried to teach men the price of worship. And when lightning flashes over the Nile, for a brief instant, the water turns dark, and in its reflection rides a man of shadow with eyes of gold. He does not speak. He does not need to. The river speaks for him. And if you listen closely, between thunder and silence, you will hear the oldest truth of all. Empires drown, but the Nile remembers. In the modern world, the desert looks peaceful from the sky. The satellites call it beautiful, the tourists call it empty. But those who live by the Nile still whisper when the wind turns south. They say the river does not flow, it listens. It has listened for thousands of years, and sometimes when the night grows too still, it answers. The story begins again with a man who did not believe in stories. His name was Dr. Karim Sadi, a historian sent to map forgotten burial sites in Sudan. He came armed with technology, drones, and data, but no faith. To him, the past was nothing but dust pretending to be important. He wanted truth that could fit into a spreadsheet. The river had other plans. One evening, his drone picked up a shadow that wasn't supposed to exist, a perfect circle, darker than the desert, 2 miles wide. He assumed it was a crater, a trick of the sun. But when he returned to his tent, he found sand inside his shoes, though he hadn't left the camp. The sand was warm. It pulsed like something alive. That night, he dreamed of footsteps in water. He stood on the riverbank, and someone beside him whispered, "You dig for bones, but you are standing on hearts." When he woke, his tent had collapsed inward, and the sound of drums rolled faintly across the dunes. His colleagues heard nothing. He followed the coordinates the next morning, driving until the sky bled into the ground. There it was, the black circle, glassy and smooth, as if lightning had struck for centuries. At its center stood something small and impossible, a chair made of fused sand, half buried, warm to the touch. Around it, carvings in the earth formed a phrase he could not read. He bent closer, and for a moment, the wind whispered the translation. "The sun waits beneath the skin." When he returned to camp, the computers failed. The recordings played only static, but beneath the noise, a rhythm pulsed, slow, steady, human. On the drone footage, his own shadow seemed to move differently, as if out of sync with his steps. The next day, he found one of his assistants staring at the river, whispering, "He's still here." Karim didn't believe in curses. He told himself history doesn't haunt, people do. But the deeper he went, the more the desert seemed to rearrange itself around him. Compass needles spun south, lights flickered in the sand, and once, just once, he saw a rider on the horizon, unmoving, framed by lightning. He blinked, and the rider was gone, but the smell of rain lingered in the air, though the sky was clear. In Cairo, he tried to report his findings. The official smiled politely, stamped his forms, and filed them under folklore. That night, he woke to find his notes rearranged. Every page had the same phrase written in his own handwriting over and over. Empires drown, the Nile remembers. He resigned a month later. No one saw him again. The last email he sent contained a single attachment, a sound file. It was faint, almost inaudible, like the rustle of distant wind. But if you listened closely, you could hear something beneath it, the rhythm of a drum, and a voice saying in a language no one could identify. The sun rises from the south. The file ended with the sound of water, slow, heavy, endless. Today, no one speaks of Dr. Karim. The desert has swallowed greater names. But on nights when the Nile swells higher than it should, when the moon turns a little too red, some people say they see him walking along the shore, head bowed, carrying a notebook that glows faintly in the dark. He stops, looks toward the horizon, and whispers, "He's awake." And the river, patient as always, ripples once in answer. Because stories do not die, they wait, buried beneath empire, beneath progress, beneath denial, waiting for another sun, another storm, another man who dares to listen. The drums begin again, and somewhere in the dark, the Black Pharaoh smiles.